This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 153, Hot Car Deaths. Since 1990, well over 1,050 children in the United States have died after being left in hot cars. An untold number of additional kids have been left with permanent brain damage and other long-term injuries. The largest percentage of these kids were unknowingly left in a vehicle by a parent or caregiver. No one wants to believe their brain is capable of this kind of failure. Many place blame on these parents, accusing them of using drugs or alcohol, or of being inattentive, neglectful, abusive, or even murderous. In reality, most kids who die in hot cars have loving, caring, and even overprotective parents. In this episode, I'll attempt to reduce the stigma surrounding hot car deaths by digging into how these tragedies happen to people just like you and me. You'll hear my conversation with Dr. David Diamond, a renowned neuroscientist who has spent decades studying the neurobiology of memory and has testified at countless hot car death trials. You'll also hear my conversation with Janette Fennell, the founder and president of Kids and Car Safety, a nonprofit agency dedicated to saving the lives of children in and around motor vehicles, whose work has led to legislation mandating multiple life-saving technologies in newly manufactured vehicles. Before I get into this incredibly important topic, I'd like to first shout out my newest patrons, Carly A. from Vancouver, BC, Canada, Mary H. from Kentucky, New Hampshire, and Angela P. from Redwood City, California. Thank you all so much for your support. To help keep the podcast going, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod or ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Among the various pledge tiers, at the $5 level, you'll get access to ad-free versions of my regular weekly episodes, and at $10, you receive access to a small but growing collection of Patreon-exclusive bonus minisodes. Thank you all. Now, let's get right into it. I've covered a single hot car death case in the past, and that involved the tragic deaths of Lorenzo and Brooklyn Velasquez, whose story I told in episodes 105 and 106. In that particular case, the kid's mother, Brittany Velasquez, knowingly left her children all day in the car instead of finding a babysitter while she went to work. In a much more recent case, on Wednesday, July 19, 2023, a 10-month-old baby in Florida died after her babysitter apparently knowingly left her in the vehicle, went inside, and forgot she left the baby in the car. This is undoubtedly a tragedy any time it occurs. Those cases of a caretaker knowingly leaving a child in a car are much more rare than what I'll be talking about today. In fact, they make up only 15% of hot car death cases. The vast majority of hot car deaths involve a loving, responsible parent or caregiver unknowingly leaving a child in a vehicle. Before I get into how that happens, I'm first going to play a clip from my coverage of the story of the Velasquez kids that explains exactly how being left in a hot car can rapidly cause a child's death. This is graphic and very difficult, but I think essential to hear. What could give someone more incentive to try to prevent such a death than knowing exactly how it occurs? I think it's important to understand exactly what happens to a small child enclosed in a hot car. Excess heat causes a small child's body temperature to rise several times faster than in adults because their little bodies aren't yet as efficient at fielding excess heat. As the child's temperature rises, they become agitated and may try to remove clothing to cool off. However, if they're strapped into a car seat, this kind of movement is impossible, leading to further agitation. The child becomes dizzy, nauseous, sweaty, thirsty, and confused. As neurological dysfunction kicks in, the body stops sweating and the skin becomes hot and red. Dehydration causes electrolyte imbalances, and toxic levels of sodium begin accumulating in the child's body. Cardiac arrhythmia and other irregularities begin, and the child's body is no longer able to regulate blood pressure. The child's skin becomes discolored, and there may be skin slippage, meaning blisters form beneath the skin as the tissue beneath begins to go through autolysis, otherwise known as self-digestion. Keep in mind, everything I've just described happens while the child is still alive. The child begins having seizures and hallucinations, experiencing delirium and a rapid heart rate, and if they're lucky, may slip into a coma. When enough cell damage has occurred, the child's organ systems will shut down in rapid succession. Hemorrhages take place in the lungs and other organs, the brain swells, and cerebral edema forms, meaning fluid accumulates around the brain. The child eventually dies as the body temperature climbs over 108 degrees Fahrenheit or 42.2 degrees Celsius, and the organs experience autolysis and necrosis or tissue death. In some cases, these children are found with their fingernails torn and bloody from trying to claw their way out, with hair torn out by their own little hands, with scratches on their own faces. Many times they're found with their eyes open. In other words, this is one of the most painful, torturous, horrifying, slow ways anyone could die, and we all need to be aware of how quickly it can happen. After even 15 minutes in a hot car, a child can experience life-threatening brain or kidney damage. The dangers of hot cars is a topic that has fascinated me for decades. I first discovered the kidsandcars.org website around 2002, before I even had kids myself, and I was both horrified by the stories of all the families who had lost children to this unseen danger, and fascinated by how it could happen as often as it did. Weren't these parents paying attention? How the hell could anyone forget their child in the car? But I couldn't help feeling terribly for them. In so many cases, the parents themselves seemed baffled about how they could have forgotten that their child, obviously the most important person in their lives, was in their vehicle. Then, in 2009, an article in the Washington Post blew my mind wide open. Gene Weingarten's Pulitzer Prize-winning piece, which I've mentioned a number of times in the past, is titled Fatal Distraction: Forgetting a Child in the Backseat of a Car is a Horrifying Mistake. Is it a crime? That article has haunted me since the moment I read it, and I've read it dozens of times since, not to mention shared it with family, friends, strangers, and listeners. Nothing has ever brought a topic into sharper focus for me. I cannot recommend this article highly enough, and I'll include a link to it, as well as many other essential links, in the show notes for this episode. Reading about the absolute devastation of these families, the Harrisons, the Parkses, the Balfours, the Culpepers, and so many more, drove home for me personally how important it is that we understand why these tragedies happen in order to understand that due to the way the human brain operates, this can happen to anyone. One of the parents interviewed for the piece, Miles Harrison, continues to tell his son Chase's story to raise awareness and to advocate for change in the automotive industry. Your heart will break just from hearing Miles tell his son's story in this clip from a press conference regarding the Hot Cars Act of 2017.
Almost 9 years ago, it was a typical day of getting everyone up and ready to head out the door, as well as getting myself to work on time. Like many parents, I was multitasking, getting my child ready, making sure we had everything packed, and rushing around with the typical morning business. My world changed forever on that day. When I went to the office, I was focused on fixing all the problems at work because that was my job. The day flew by. I went to lunch with my boss to fill him in on the status of the work, my only break of the day. Then, having no idea what time it was, a colleague came up to me in my office around 5 o'clock. "Hey, "Do you have a doll in your car?" Stunned, I had no idea why he would ask such a question, and I couldn't imagine what he was talking about. I stood up and started to go through what I had done that day, and then realized, oh my God, no. I rushed to the car and came across the side window, and I saw Chase. I had not dropped him off at daycare. I ripped open the car door, I pulled him from the car seat, unaware of anyone around, and ran into the office with him in my arms, screaming, crying, calling out for help. I was so distraught, upset, and completely incapacitated. I spent hours in the ER. The nurse offered me painkillers, but I refused. I did not feel I deserved them. I wanted to feel the pain. Without any compassion, the police demanded that I be brought to the station immediately and interviewed. They started asking me questions about, did I have life insurance on my son? It started to hit me then. I had killed my son. I did it. My poor, sweet boy. God, take me now. And return my son to his beautiful mother. Please, God, not him, me. I had to be hospitalized for several weeks and even register under a fake name because I would have been arrested the moment I left the hospital. Tragically, I was not even allowed to attend the funeral of my son. My story continues with a very public trial, fighting a charge of involuntary manslaughter, of which, thank God, I was found not guilty after 3 days in the courtroom. It really did not matter to me whether I was found guilty or innocent. I considered myself guilty of and full of shame and anger. I cry every day for Chase. I still have not forgiven myself, and I don't know if I have the capacity to do so. I look at my wife in amazement. She has never wavered. She stayed with me, and we are still together. She is the most beautiful and wonderful wife in the world. After my trial, Gene Weingarten wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning article titled Fatal Distraction about parents who have gone through what my family went through. He somehow was able to capture the essence of how otherwise wonderful parents could be involved in a parent's worst nightmare. He was able to explain this modern-day phenomena in a way that people could understand and relate to. The death of our precious baby boy became an international incident. The Russian government banned all adoptions of American children and named the law after our son Chase. We were bombarded with news articles written about what a terrible person I am and how this could never happen to responsible people. But frankly, the daily beating I give to myself is far more brutal than anything I have ever read about myself on the internet. This did not have to happen. If there had been a simple chime alert of my son's presence, none of this would have happened. How can this be that in our great country, it is not mandatory that the simplest alarm not be required in all cars? Children are dying unnecessarily. Families are being destroyed unnecessarily. This has got to stop. It is so important that we pass this bill being introduced today. In our son Chase's honor, we have made it our mission to try to prevent this unspeakable tragedy from happening to any parents. Every time we hear of another child dying, we relive that horrible day with them over and over again, and we ask why. Why does this keep happening when there is technology available to prevent it? Every loving, caring parent must realize that this disaster could happen to them. They need to be aware of this phenomenon and make sure Congress mandates a vehicle alarm system to save the lives of our children and eliminate this crushing pain this causes their parents. Thank you.
In this interview, Lynn Balfour, another parent who freely speaks about her son Bryce's hot car death, speaks with the Globe and Mail about what happened.
It had been a very busy week. He had been sick with a cold. He didn't sleep hardly at all that night. My husband and I were exhausted. Normally, my husband dropped him off at daycare, but this particular week, my husband was riding with me. I was dropping him off first and then the baby. And I got a phone call on the way to work, and I instantly went into work mode. And I got to work, got out of the car, and went in, not realizing that I accidentally forgot to drop him off at daycare.
And so then what happened? How did you find him?
The babysitter called me that morning. We had no safety mechanism in place in case he didn't show up. And she just assumed that I had stayed home with him because he had been sick with a cold. But I had missed her call. Then when I was getting ready to leave work, she called me at the end of the day just to find out how Bryce was doing. And I said, "What do you mean? He's with you?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, did Jarrett pick him up early?" Then she said, "No, Lynn, you didn't drop him off. He's not here." And I realized at that instant, oh my God, maybe he's still in the car. So I ran to my car, and that's where I found him. And he was not breathing.
So you have made it your mission to speak about this as much as you can so that you can inform other parents. And I'm sure you're aware that people judge you for having made this mistake. So what makes you keep going?
Because I made a promise to my son when I held him in the hospital for the last time to make sure that his death would not be for nothing. That as many parents as I could reach, grandparents, aunts and uncles, anyone who would listen, would understand that it can absolutely happen to them. Society puts a priority on what we forget, not the brain. So if you can forget your cell phone, if you've ever forgotten your purse, if you've ever forgotten anything that you needed to take care of or do, you can absolutely forget your child. We talk about baby-proofing our homes. Everyone nowadays, you buy all of the mechanisms and all of the safety gate and all the things that we can do, even alarms on our pool systems, in order to make sure that if there's a ripple in the water, we're alerted. But we do not baby-proof our vehicles. And currently in the U.S., there are more non-vehicular deaths of children in cars and in vehicles than there are in home fatalities or accidents. We need to start educating, because no parent wants to come up and raise their hand and say, "Yeah, I almost did that as well." So we don't have any valid statistics on how many close calls there have been.
Lynn also spoke with 7 News about Bryce's death. Quick warning, just before the interview, you'll hear brief clips from the 911 call reporting Bryce's death. Lynn's screams in the background are gut-wrenching.
911.
Yes, we need. Did you get it, sir?
Hello?
We got someone on the phone with an operator right now.
Where are you?
Charlottesville, Virginia. We have a toddler that's passed out and not doing well.
Does anybody know CPR?
The mother's performing CPR right now.
Okay, we've got help on the way.
Oh my God, no!
Are you?
I was hoping that it wasn't too late. So I started screaming for someone to call 911, and I took him out of the car and I began CPR. And I prayed to God to take me instead, to please not take him. And after about another 10 minutes, another doctor came in and she told me that they couldn't save him, that he was gone. And I sat there and said to myself, how am I going to tell my husband that I killed his son?
What kind of mother or father forgets their baby?
Before my son's death, I would say an irresponsible parent, someone that didn't have their priorities straight. After my son died, I would say any loving parent. I managed $47 million worth of projects in Iraq with every penny accounted for the U.S. military. How can I forget my son? If you would have asked me or given me a lie detector test even today, I would tell you that he was at the daycare provider's house and that he was okay and he was fine. Bryce was such a happy, bubbly little baby. He never cried. My mom often says that she thinks that he had such a wonderful, special personality because he probably knew he wasn't going to be here for very long. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about him. They waited until the day of my son's funeral to charge me. It doesn't matter whether I went to jail. I'm in a prison every day, every day. I've talked to parents straight to their, face and in person that have told me it could never happen to them. And I ask them one question. Are you willing to bet your child's life on it, that it would never happen to you? Are you willing to do that? Because if you're not, whether you agree with me or not, you have to read the information and take the necessary precautions.
Stephanie Salvia, who was also criminally prosecuted for her son Gannon's hot car death, told 7 News.
When I had Gannon, I had 3 driving routes I tested to see which one I felt safest driving with 2 kids in the car. I'm very safety oriented. And I got in my car and I sat down, I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw him in the rearview mirror and I just started screaming, no, no. Memories are very vulnerable. Your brain has remembered something incorrectly, and because it's your brain and it's what you rely on, you're a victim of it. You have absolutely no idea that it's lying to you. Absolutely no idea.
And finally, listen to this body cam and interrogation audio of police talking to Stacy Holly, an Arizona mother who forgot her 5-month-old baby in the car while she, along with her sister and her other child, shopped inside a Target store. Police on the scene said Stacy appeared remorseful and perplexed as to how she forgot her baby in the car. Fortunately, Stacy's baby survived. Stacy was initially charged with child endangerment and reckless child abuse.
We forgot her. I don't know how we forgot her, but we just forgot her. I honestly don't know how it happened. I don't. I'm freaking out. I'm sorry. I don't know how it happened. Like, how do you forget your baby?
I think that these people who do it, who you see on TV, I'm like, God, how stupid are they to leave their kids in the car? Mm-hmm. And then it happened.
You understand the seriousness of what happened?
Yes.
Okay.
1,000%.
Fortunately, Stacy's charges were ultimately dismissed. I'll quote here from Mr. Weingarten's Washington Post article. Death by hyperthermia is the official designation. When it happens to young children, the facts are often the same. An otherwise loving and attentive parent one day gets busy or distracted or upset or confused by a change in his or her daily routine and just forgets a child is in the car. 2 decades ago, this was relatively rare. But in the early 1990s, car safety experts declared that passenger-side front airbags could kill children, and they recommended that child seats be moved to the back of the car. Then, for even more safety for the very young, that the baby seats be pivoted to face the rear. If few foresaw the tragic consequence of the lessened visibility of the child, well, who can blame them? What kind of person forgets a baby? The wealthy do, it turns out, and the poor and the middle class. Parents of all ages and ethnicities do it. Mothers are just as likely to do it as fathers. It happens to the chronically absent-minded and to the fanatically organized, to the college-educated and to the marginally literate. In the last 10 years, it has happened to a dentist, a postal clerk, a social worker, a police officer, an accountant, a soldier, a paralegal, an electrician, a Protestant clergyman, a rabbinical student, a nurse, a construction worker, an assistant principal. It happened to a mental health counselor, a college professor, and a pizza chef. It happened to a pediatrician. It happened to a rocket scientist. The facts in each case differ a little, but always there is the terrible moment when the parent realizes what he or she has done, often through a phone call from a spouse or caregiver. This is followed by a frantic sprint to the car. What awaits there is the worst thing in the world. I'll pause here for a quick sponsor break. When it comes to tragedies like this, the public at large wants someone to blame, and all too often, due to ignorance, that blame is pointed squarely at the parent whose brain simply failed them. Listen to this brief clip from Susan Morgan Cooper's 2020 documentary, also titled Fatal Distraction, which I'll talk more about in a moment. These are people on the street reacting to the very idea that a parent could truly forget their child in a hot car.
I would never leave my child in the car. I don't see how parents can forget that.
There's not a moment that goes by when I'm not like, where is she? What's she doing? What's going on with her? And so for someone to say that that was an accident, I couldn't believe it.
I've always wanted to have a child. I couldn't imagine forgetting him.
I don't care how busy you are, or how little sleep you get, how stressed you are.
No way I would ever forget where my kid is at.
How can somebody do it?
That type of well-meaning but indisputably ignorant gut reaction is a huge part of why I'm making this episode. If you've heard my podcast before, you know how strongly I feel about having empathy for innocent family members and about refraining from victim blaming. In my opinion, and in the opinion of countless experts, including the two you'll hear me speak with later in this episode, these parents are victims of their own fallible human brains. So why do people continue to react this way despite all the research, the public safety awareness campaigns, and all the other available information out there dealing with hot car deaths? In his article, Mr. Weingarten quoted Ed Hickling, a New York clinical psychologist who spent time studying the effects of fatal auto accidents on surviving drivers, who he said were often judged with disproportionate harshness by the public, even when the accidents were not their fault. Dr. Hickling said it came down to the human need to believe that if we are careful and responsible enough, we can avoid terrible things happening to us. He said, "We are vulnerable, but we don't want to be reminded of that. We want to believe that the world is understandable and controllable and unthreatening, that if we follow the rules, we'll be okay. So when this kind of thing happens to other people, we need to put them in a different category from us. We don't want to resemble them, and the fact that we might is too terrifying to deal with." Mr. Weingarten himself said in the Fatal Distraction documentary,
"People have a need to demonize the person to whom it actually happens so that they can feel in their minds, this could not happen to me, this could only happen to a monster."
But why are so many people inclined to victim blame like this instead of simply accepting that this could happen to them? Experts think a lot of it is because humans want to believe we live in a just world in which good things happen to good people and bad things happen only to people who deserve them. In that worldview, it's your own responsibility to avoid being victimized, and if something terrible does befall you, you must have somehow brought it on yourself. Your house was robbed? You must have left the door unlocked or been too flashy about your expensive purchases. You were raped? You must have worn something skimpy or somehow encouraged the offender's behavior, or you were out too late. You got cancer? You must have smoked or drank or used the wrong shampoo or cleaning products. Your child died in a hot car? You must be a bad, selfish, negligent parent. Research has shown that our tendency to blame victims to protect our you reap what you sow worldview is not set in stone, and in fact, there is a very simple way to counter this reaction: practicing empathy. Researchers have found that by asking test subjects to imagine how they would feel if subjected to the same painful or negative experience as a designated victim in an experiment, the test subjects had a much more empathetic response and no longer felt the need to blame the victim for their own plight. Practicing empathy and being open to seeing the world from other perspectives can legitimately and significantly decrease these damaging victim-blaming behaviors, including speculation about what a victim could have or should have done differently to avoid being victimized. Using the benefit of hindsight to pick apart the victim's actions is still victim blaming. What we need is to practice empathy in the aftermath of these tragedies and to employ preventative measures to keep them from happening. It's bad enough when the public turns on a parent in the midst of a tragedy like this. When law enforcement and criminal prosecution comes into play in these cases, things can get immeasurably worse. Whether or not criminal charges result from hot car deaths or near misses varies wildly from state to state, county to county, and even case to case. According to data analysis of the Kids and Car Safety Database, in cases in which a child died after a parent or caregiver unknowingly left them in a vehicle, over 50% face criminal charges, and the majority of these are ultimately convicted, either through trial or a plea agreement. I watched the Fatal Distraction documentary in preparation for this episode, and I can't describe the pit it left in my stomach or estimate the number of tears I shed while watching it. In a nutshell, I'll give you the case it centers on, just in case you're not familiar. I followed this story from the moment it hit the headlines in 2014, and because of the information presented in the media, I was adamant that the accused was 1,000% guilty. I don't feel that way anymore. On June 18, 2014, Justin Ross Harris strapped his 22-month-old son, Cooper, into his rear-facing car seat in the back of Ross's Hyundai Tucson. The father and son duo stopped for breakfast at Chick-fil-A, after which Ross was supposed to drop Cooper off at daycare. Instead, he passed the turn and drove directly to his job at the Home Depot corporate headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, where he walked into the office. Over the next several hours, Cooper, still strapped into his car seat, succumbed to hyperthermia. Ross left work around 4:16 p.m., heading toward a movie theater where he planned to meet with friends. Along the way, he noticed Cooper in his car seat, pulled into a shopping center parking lot, and tried to perform CPR on his dead son before a witness took over. Ross was interviewed at the police station and charged with murder the same evening. The prosecution of Ross's case centered around the fact that the married 33-year-old father of one had been sexting several women and a teenage girl throughout the day while Cooper was dying in the car. Prosecutors called this a motive for murder, despite an overwhelming amount of evidence pointing to the fact that Ross was an excellent father. His ex-wife and Cooper's mom, Leanna, testified on his behalf in that regard. Even though Ross was a terrible husband and not a great human being, it was proven at trial that he was indisputably a good dad. Still, in November of 2016, a jury of his peers found Justin Ross Harris guilty of murder, child cruelty, criminal attempt to commit sexual exploitation of children, and dissemination of harmful materials to minors. He was sentenced to life plus 34 years in prison. Much of the damning evidence against Ross was misrepresented by the prosecution and the media in the early stages of the case, and it was that evidence that planted me firmly in the he did it camp from the start. Only when I learned that the Georgia Supreme Court overturned Ross's convictions for murder and child cruelty last year did I start questioning my belief that he intended to kill Cooper. Earlier this year, the Cobb County District Attorney's Office announced that they will not retry Ross on the murder and child cruelty charges. His convictions on the 2 charges related to sexting an underage girl were upheld, and he will continue serving his 12-year sentence for those crimes. The Fatal Distraction documentary really cemented for me how wrong law enforcement, prosecutors, and the media got this case, and how justice for Cooper did not equal throwing his dad in prison for life when he truly did not intend to kill his son. This is a tough case to look at because it can be hard for some people to reconcile that just because Ross's other behaviors were disgusting and criminal doesn't mean he deserves a life sentence for unintentionally leaving his sweet little boy, who he cherished, in the car to die. Ross's ex-wife, Leanna, made this gut-wrenching statement in the documentary.
Their primary goal was to prove that Ross was a good parent and that he loved Cooper. And the sad thing is that they did that, and a jury of 12 people still got together and convicted him of not just unintentionally harming his child, which is bad. They convicted him of premeditated murder, and they convicted him of that without any evidence that he actually did plan it out. And that should scare every person listening. Because just as it was Ross, it could be you. And have parents stopped forgetting their children in the backseat of cars because Justin Ross Harris is in the Valdosta State Prison right now, serving life without parole? Have children stopped dying? No.
For anyone who's ever been interested in Cooper's case, the prosecution of hot car deaths, or wrongful convictions, I highly recommend watching the documentary. I rented it on Amazon Prime for a few dollars, but it's also available to watch on other streaming services like Tubi for free. Now I'll take a quick sponsor break, after which you'll hear my conversation with Dr. David Diamond, Professor of Psychology, Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology, and Director of the Neuroscience Collaborative Program and Center for Preclinical and Clinical Research on PTSD at the University of South Florida. Without exaggeration, Dr. Diamond's credentials and accomplishments go on for pages and pages. He has spent decades studying the neurobiology of memory and how it correlates to children being forgotten in cars.
I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of South Florida. I've been studying the brain and memory now for over 40 years. My specialty is really the mechanisms of memory, how stress affects memory. I've been publishing about over 100, maybe about 150 papers on all about the brain and memory. I've had the pleasure to be supported both by federal organizations such as NIH, and I was just retired recently as a career scientist at the VA because part of my research is on post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and to understand how it is that we can produce these really powerful memories that can last a lifetime when they're traumatic memories. But I'm also interested in how it is we forget really important bits of information. So for about the last 15 years, I've been studying how it is that people make catastrophic memory failures. And these cover quite a different range of memory failures. And one in particular, which I guess we'll be talking about, is how is it possible that really good, loving parents can forget their children in cars? And that can result in children dying of heat stroke.
And what made you interested in that particular topic? Did a particular case come up that you were asked to consult on, or how did that come about?
It's interesting how memory works. I remember about 15 years ago, someone, a news reporter, out of the blue gave me a call and asked me to explain, as a memory expert, how it is that parents forget children in cars, and then told me about a child that died of heat stroke. And I have to admit that at the time I knew nothing of the sort. I was absolutely of no benefit to this reporter whatsoever. And in fact, my knee-jerk reaction was to be judgmental. I said, we've been studying memory, frankly, for centuries, and I've never heard of such a thing, of a parent forgetting a child in a car. And so at that moment, really, I felt helpless because I had no idea about it, and I also felt judgmental. But as a scientist and as a parent, I was curious. So that sort of began my adventure, my expedition into this area of research. I found a great organization called kidsincars.org, and they had been categorizing the rather large number of children that had died in hot cars for decades. I did research myself into it, and that actually just led me, really as a scientist, to study the different ways in which people have these catastrophic memory failures, such as you have a pilot that is taxiing down the runway and preparing to take off. The pilot is distracted. They don't set the flaps properly on the plane. This actually happened decades ago. The plane attempts to take off because the flaps aren't set properly. They forgot to set them properly, and there was no technology working. The plane crashes, and hundreds of people die. I'll give you another example. Police officers. This happened many times. They use a public restroom, remove their weapons, their guns from their holster, use the restroom, and then walk out of the restroom, leaving a loaded weapon in a public bathroom. How does that happen? This is a phenomenon that I'm fascinated by. And I can also tell you from personal experience, my grandchild was born about 14 years ago. And the first time we were driving with her, my wife and I, without her mother, she was in the back seat, quiet, out of sight, facing the rear. I completely lost awareness that she was in the car when we arrived at our destination. I was ready to walk away from the car, and I think about this pretty often. If I had been alone, I might have contributed to the statistics on children dying in hot cars, especially since I live in Florida and a car heats up very quickly. But fortunately, my wife said to me, "Are you forgetting something?" And I had no idea what she was talking about. And so she said, "The baby is in the car." And right at that moment, it was really quite horrifying, actually, because I realized I completely lost track of our grandchild in the car. So this, for me, is something that I've realized it can happen to anyone. So I'm interested personally as well as scientifically in the process.
That's very interesting, and it must have really brought it home to you at that moment.
Yeah, and if I could elaborate as well, what happened was then I got some attention in the media from talking about this. And then there was a great article by Gene Weingarten in the Washington Post, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2010. And he quoted me as talking about how it's possible to forget children in cars. And I've gotten to know so many parents who have been traumatized because they not only lost their children as a result of dying of heat stroke, and it takes so little heat to cause a child to die very rapidly in a hot car. And then I've served now as an expert witness because these parents and caretakers are charged with manslaughter or murder. And people have actually been found guilty of manslaughter, and they're now in prison for decades because of this kind of memory failure. And so I have testified in quite a few trials to try to explain to a jury how it's possible really good parents can make this kind of catastrophic memory failure.
Gene Weingarten's piece in the Washington Post, it's stuck in my brain since I read it way back when. I often revisit it. It's so powerful, and just the way he describes what these parents have gone through. And that's why I felt the need to do this episode. And I want to try to take away a little bit of the stigma on it and make it more well understood why it can happen to anyone. As Mr. Weingarten mentioned in the article, it's happened to people from all walks of life, up to a NASA scientist.
Right. Professors, teachers, doctors, lawyers, white collar, blue collar. It cuts men, women, mothers, fathers, grandparents. I mean, who's vulnerable? To be human makes you vulnerable.
So it can happen to anyone.
Yes, I assert that. Even though majority of people are in denial, and this is the greatest problem I think we're faced with, is in surveys you find that 70 to 80% of people can accept that it can happen to someone else, but it wouldn't happen to them. And that's a problem because the thing people say is everybody has memory failures. Everybody forgets something. You know, you forget where you parked your car or where you left your keys. You forget someone's name. And people will say that. But you just don't forget a child in a car. And I find that very appealing. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. And, you know, if we were to design a brain that would take the most important items that you don't want to forget. And I tell people, imagine you could just place a beacon like right in your view. You know, kind of like when we have a recording and there's a flashing red light. And in that flashing red light, it says, baby in car. Well, that would be perfect. You'd always have that reminder right in your view. And the real problem is people get complacent because a child is so important. They can't imagine ever leaving a child in a car. And that's actually where we have the problem. We have reminders all the time. We put a reminder in our cell phone, right, to tell us you have a doctor's appointment later today. Don't forget. You have to go pick something up. You put a reminder in your phone. The alarm goes off and it reminds you of what you need to do. The idea that you should have a reminder that your child is in the car just seems like you're accepting the possibility that you're not a good parent. Only good parents, right, would never forget a child in a car. And that's where I think people get in trouble because they believe they could never forget a child in a car. And in fact, the parents who actually have said that I have interviewed, that I've gotten to know, they had said, I could never forget my child. And then it happened to them and their child died.
That's just the saddest possible outcome. I can only imagine what they go through and what they put themselves through.
There are different kinds of outcomes. Not all children die. I had a case in which a child suffered from heat stroke and then suffered permanent brain damage. And you think about what these parents are now faced with, that the child lived, but will have permanent brain damage, and they have to live with that reminder that their child will be damaged for the rest of his life, and it was the father's fault. So there's different forms of suffering that happen as a result of children being left in cars.
Yeah, I don't think we think about that very often either. The fact that the child doesn't always die, or they're sometimes rescued, but it's not a positive outcome necessarily.
Right.
How would you explain the process, what happens in the brain, or how this can happen?
I always like to be a little cautious in explaining this because, frankly, when I explain this, I know that there will be people who will be offended. And in a sense, I apologize in advance, but this is just the science of it all. We have, you can consider two basic brain memory systems. There's a conscious brain memory system and a subconscious brain memory system. The conscious brain memory system is what we are aware of. We make plans. We say, for example, today, I want to stop at the store on the way home. We use what's called the frontal cortex to make that plan. And the frontal cortex has to do with all conscious processing. We have another conscious memory system that's focused around a brain structure called the hippocampus. The way to think about the brain is it's not just one homogeneous soup like Jell-O. The brain has multiple organs, just like we have in our body, like the liver function is different from heart function. Well, in the brain, we have different organs. And so, as I said, the frontal cortex allows us to make plans for the future. The hippocampus enables us to have memories, conscious memories. So we then use the hippocampus to say, okay, while I'm driving, I want to interrupt my drive to go to the store. And it's the hippocampus's responsibility to interrupt my drive so that I remember at just the right time to stop my drive and go to the store. And then, of course, the hippocampus has to remind us what it is we want to buy in the store. As we're driving, what happens? We get into a routine because most of the time when we're going home, we go straight from, let's say, work to home. So we have this other brain memory system, which really makes life very convenient. This is our habit-based memory system, and it operates sort of at a subconscious level. The habit-based brain memory system takes us directly from work to go home without having to think about it. And one way to image this in your mind is the very first time you drive somewhere, you have to use GPS. You have to have directions right in front of you so you know where to make turns, what are the names of the streets. And that's a very conscious effort. But once you do that a bunch of times, you make those turns automatically. And that's the really great thing about our habit memory system. It allows us to do something automatically at a subconscious level. And if you've ever, for example, on a weekend when you don't need to go to work, but you're driving sort of an overlapping route, you find yourself almost making the turn toward work when you don't have to go to work that day. So the habit memory system is now taking you on that route. So here you are going home from work and you go right past the store. You completely lose awareness of the plan that you wanted to stop your route and go to store. And in fact, I like to use the example of, let's say my wife has called me and asked me to pick up groceries on the way home from work, to which I'm completely agreeable. I arrive at home and I'm completely unaware of why it is she's unhappy with me. Well, that's because I haven't picked up the groceries. And you can even ramp it up to make it more important. Let's say I needed to pick up medication at the pharmacy. And of course, I forgot that as well, which is a really common phenomenon that people can relate to. So you arrive at home, you haven't picked up the item, and the explanation you give sounds really weak. Well, I forgot. Well, you forgot to do something really important. And why did you forget? Because you have a competition between the habit-based brain memory system, which is called the basal ganglia, and the hippocampus and the frontal cortex, both of which at some level are screaming, saying, stop, you need to go to the store. But your basal ganglia can suppress that conscious memory system, and it takes you straight from work and you go home. And this happens all the time, and there's actually brain imaging studies in which you can see when people do something out of habit, you actually are less likely to use your conscious-based memory system. And what you really need is a cue, either a sound or something visual. And so an example I like to give is when I really need to interrupt my route, I will put a sticky note right on my steering wheel. And the sticky note says, stop at the store on the way home. So I am looking at that as I'm driving. And that helps me then to activate my hippocampus and my frontal cortex. If we now relate that to children forgotten in cars, what we have is a pattern, a very consistent pattern, which happens in every case that I've studied. And so let's take an example which illustrates this. Let's say the mother is always taking the child to daycare. And one day the mother's not available for whatever reason. And so the father says, sure, I'll drop off the baby to daycare. So the father puts the child in the car seat, has every intention to take the child to daycare on the way to work. So you have an overlapping route. And I'm using this as an example of the father, but it happens just as often with mothers. He uses his frontal cortex to plan the route. He uses his hippocampus to say, today I've got my child in the car, unlike most routes. He then starts the route. He is driving, and at that point in which he is supposed to stop, interrupt the route, take the child to daycare, what happens? The habit-based memory system takes over and takes him straight from home to work. And this is what's crucial. At the moment in which he arrives at work, he has completely lost awareness that the child is in the car. And so what you've got is a child that is out of view, that is quiet. And so the father, and really just call this the parent, has lost awareness of the child in the car. So at that moment in which the driver has now exited the car, that driver has lost awareness that the child is in the car. The parent now goes to work. Now, the parent has not lost awareness that he or she has a child. This is where it's difficult for people to understand. The parent typically, this is amazing, will talk about the child, looks at a picture of the child, tells people at the end of the day, I have to leave now to go pick up my child at daycare. And this happens so often. There are two ways in which it can happen. The person now comes back to the car and either notices the child, and it's an out-of-body kind of experience. Why is my child still in the car? My child's supposed to be in daycare. And the reason why the parent says that to him or herself is because the brain has created a false memory that, in fact, the child is at daycare. And that's why they're so certain that their child should be at daycare, and there's just something wrong with the child being in the back seat. And often the child has now died. And so the parent has a traumatic memory of seeing a dead child in the back seat. The other way in which the memory is evoked, and this has happened in so many cases, the parent gets in the car, drives to daycare, or drives around and conducts some errands. Parent gets to daycare and says, where is my child? I'm here to pick him up. And they say, well, you never dropped your child off. And an argument can ensue. Of course I dropped my child off. And then the terror now occurs. That horrific possibility that the parent says to him or herself, oh my God, did I leave my child in the car? And they go out and they find that the child is in the car and the child has died. So that, in a nutshell, is how it happens and how these parents now have to deal with the trauma of realizing that their memory failure led to their child dying.
God, I can only imagine. It was described so well in Gene Weingarten's piece.
It really was a beautiful, beautiful piece.
It really was. And it's so disturbing to think that it could happen to anyone. But that's the important part to me is making that more well known and making it understood how it can happen. And I'm sure there will still be people who resist, of course, and say, I understand the brain process, but it could never happen to me.
I will share with you, my wife still says it could never happen to her.
Wow.
My stepdaughter, who has 3 children, said it could never happen to her. So despite the fact that I can explain the science to them, they both still say it would happen to someone else. It couldn't happen to me.
That must be the most frustrating part about trying to educate people about this.
It is frustrating. And now I do like that my son, who has just recently become a father, says he accepts that it could happen to him. So he's taking measures to be sure that he doesn't forget his brand new baby in the car.
Oh, that's excellent. What type of measures will he take? That's what I wanted to ask as well. Or what kind of tips might you offer to parents on ways to remember?
Well, the first is, and what I'm really pleased about, is that I helped, along with the Kids in Cars group, Janette and Amber, to have a federal law passed, which just passed recently, that at some point, hopefully in the near future, all new cars will be required to have a child detection system as standard equipment. And so that's something in the future. And there are some cars now, and they've been actually around for a few years, that do have a standard equipment child detection system. It's not perfect technology, but it's far better than nothing. So there are cars available right now that do have that kind of technology. I do think in the future it will be better technology, but at least it's a start. Most cars right now don't have that technology. So I tell people there's a really simple, low-tech form of approach that enables people to be aware of their child in a car. And of course, first, it does require that people accept the possibility they could forget their child. Once they do that, the recommendation I make is that they should always have something in the car seat when the child's not there, such as a stuffed animal, a toy of the child's. When you put the child in the car seat, you then take that object out, bring it in the front of the car directly in view of the driver. I mean, one possibility is, and there's actually a product out there, is you take this object which has a little Velcro and it could attach directly to the steering wheel. And so it's kind of like the sticky note that I use. That, let's say, a little teddy bear, very small teddy bear that has a little Velcro on it. You attach it to the steering wheel, which doesn't interfere with your ability to turn the steering wheel. And as you're driving, when you're seeing that object, it is an explicit reminder that on this drive, your child is in the back seat of the car. So that to me is a low-tech approach to how to make it a lot less likely that you'll forget a child in the car.
That's a great idea. And I've heard about some technology that either detects weight or movement in the car. Does the legislation specify what type of technology it is?
I do think it's unfortunate, but then again, maybe that's the nature of legislation, is that they can't legislate the specific technology. And so the idea has to be that it's very effective technology, but there are a variety of different ways. My concern, for example, with using a phone app is that, phones can fail. What really is ideal is to have something built into the car that can potentially use the internal Bluetooth of the car. To me, that would be ideal. Sure, there are apps around, but you've got to have the phone working properly, the app working properly, and the detection system in the car has to work properly. So I don't like the idea of using multiple devices, and I don't like the idea that you've got to manually activate an app. I have heard of car seats that either can be modified to have a child detection system, or there is even a child detection system that I learned of through Kids in Cars, and they would be best. Especially Janette and Amber know about the details, and Amber actually has one that she uses for her child. It's actually, I believe, built into the car seat. So there are ways for people to take action to be certain that they are unlikely then to forget a child. And I also want to give some numbers. See, part of the reason I think why people can be in denial is, well, any child that dies in a car is a tragedy. But the rate at which children are forgotten is extremely low, and it's very fortunate. I mean, think about it. In a country of 300 million people, we have about 30 children die each year as a result of being forgotten. So you can imagine now, you're talking again, if you cut it down to how many parents there are driving children around, the odds of a child dying in a hot car are about 1 in a million, which enables most people to be complacent or in denial. It is an extremely rare event. But when it does occur, it is extremely traumatic. One way to think about the numbers is the likelihood of anybody winning the lottery is, let's say, 1 in a million or 10 million. And yet people buy lottery tickets. Why? Because they could be that one person in a million that will win. Well, anybody who thinks they can win the lottery should take those same numbers and realize, well, if you think you can be the 1 in a million that will have a positive outcome, then it's also possible that you'll be the 1 in a million that will have a really negative outcome, which is to forget your child in a car. So I kind of think that works with some people.
It definitely puts it in different perspective. I think a lot of people do need that type of perspective to wrap their brain around this. it is hard to understand as just a layperson. I've looked at it for so long that I have absolutely wrapped my brain around it, and I couldn't even begin to imagine myself doing it, but I knew it was something I could do. It could happen to me.
Now, let me add as well, I do find that people that are the strongest in being judgmental are stay-at-home parents or people who don't routinely drive to and from work. And so, for example, in my family, my stepdaughter and my wife don't routinely drive to work in which they need to drop off a child to daycare. So it really fits a pattern in which it is a parent or caretaker that needs to take a child to daycare. Obviously, that's sort of a prerequisite. Because if a child's at home all day, obviously, you're not going to forget a child. And if you're going on a unique kind of drive, it's very rare. I mean, think about it. If you go to the store, that may not be something you're doing out of habit. But still, it's possible. It's the parent that drives to the store often, but without the child, is still vulnerable to forgetting the child as long as they're doing something out of habit. And so that's really what's most important. The people who are the most judgmental are the people who don't drive somewhere out of habit. And that's why it's so hard for them to imagine forgetting a child in a car. People have to evaluate, do I do drives out of habit that do not include the child? And then is it the rare event in which I'm now driving somewhere where I've driven many times, and on this drive, it includes my child, who is now out of sight, in a sense, out of mind. And that's, I think, where people need to think about. How often am I in that situation? And if you are in that situation, then you really just have to accept it's not that I'm a bad parent, it's that I'm human. And being human means you can make this kind of memory failure.
I'll pause here for another quick word from my sponsors. It's typically younger children who would be facing backwards, but sometimes it does happen also to forward-facing children or even slightly older children as a result of being forgotten.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's even harder for people to understand. But really, when people are driving on a routine, they're not typically looking in the back seat. And so you're absolutely right. It happens to older children because if you've got a sleeping child that's even 2 years of age, that child's facing forward and the driver's facing forward. And even if the driver's looking in the rearview mirror, they're looking outside the car. They're not looking into the back seat. So yes, it'll happen as well when children are facing forward. And I have to say, there are so many near tragedies that people have told me about. In fact, Gene Weingarten was motivated to write that article because he had an experience, like so many other parents, in which he was supposed to take his daughter to daycare, and he lost awareness of her in the car. He drove to work, and she's still in the car. He had lost awareness of her. And just as he was approaching his work, his daughter made a sound. And suddenly he said he realized, wow, I had forgotten her in the car. And if she hadn't made that sound, then he would have left her in the car, and who knows what would have happened. So that often I have so many parents tell me either they just happened to notice the child happened to make a sound, or they had to get something out of the back seat and discovered that their child was still in the car. So there's a pattern that occurs, and that pattern is the loss of awareness. And either the parent discovers that the child is in the back seat or they don't. And if they don't, then tragedy can occur.
And how does additional stress or change in routine play into the phenomenon?
Yeah, that's an important question. That's an important factor. So the first is, and I'll give myself as an example, that time when I lost awareness, people don't like the word forget. I mean, because forgetting, it seems to trivialize the phenomenon, but that's in fact what happens. I forgot about my infant grandchild in the back seat. In that case, the only thing really was, it's a routine drive, no stress, no sleep deprivation, normal drive. And that is just time. So the first factor is always time. And it doesn't take much. It can be a matter of a couple of minutes. Once you get into a habit, drive, a routine, in a matter of minutes, you can lose awareness of a child. So that's the first factor. What makes it more likely that someone will forget, and this has been studied extensively, is when you're stressed, you are more likely then to have your habit-based system take over. Because your brain is now focused on the stress, you lose awareness of what you're actually trying to keep track of. And so stress makes us forgetful. And the reason why stress makes us forgetful is because the brain now is focusing on the stress itself. And so that's a second factor that increases the likelihood that people will forget a child in a car. And that stress can be outside the car if you have a very stressful life, which is just, that's life as a parent of a young child. It can be very stressful. Or stress in the car. So I had a couple cases. 2 women received very stressful phone calls. They had to deal with personal and family issues. And that stress took their awareness away from the child to the phone call. And in both cases, the child died. So stress is a factor. Sleep deprivation makes it more likely we will do things out of habit. And so again, that's just a part of being a parent of an infant, is to be sleep deprived. When we are sleep deprived, we're more likely to do things out of habit, and our hippocampus and our frontal cortex, they don't work very well when we're sleep deprived. That's why you feel kind of groggy. It's hard to pay attention if you haven't had a good night's sleep. Again, that's a part of being a parent of a young child. So those 2 factors, along with multitasking, if you got a lot on your mind, it's like juggling the balls, and then keeping track of all these balls that are in the air and one falls. So the first most important thing is driving on a route that involves some kind of habit. Stress and sleep deprivation, multitasking, they all increase the likelihood that you forget something that you're holding in your mind.
That makes perfect sense. If you're looking at the brain as a series of organs and they all have to work together, that makes me wonder if there's been any effect on the numbers based on long COVID symptoms. I've experienced that myself as far as being more forgetful, less cognitively aware and functional. So I forget things all the time now. And I have to wonder if that has played into any of the more recent statistics.
It's a really great question, and it potentially can be addressed experimentally if either people who have had COVID are obsessed with COVID fears, have perhaps had long COVID, which can affect the brain and memory. If there's an association of children being forgotten in cars with any COVID-related influence. I have not seen anything to provide any evidence to answer your question. The rate of children dying in hot cars has not increased. There actually were very few. From a scientific perspective, it's really interesting that in 2020, actually was an extremely low rate of children dying in hot cars. And so when you look at that, the question is why? And that's because, in general, children weren't taken places. And 21, the numbers were low as well. And what's happened is it's now picked up, and I believe we're at about at least 10 children have been forgotten in cars this year so far.
As far as age goes, what would you say would be the oldest child that you have had to consult on the case? Because I know there was a 4-year-old in Pennsylvania, Samaria, that you testified about. And that one, I think, has a lot of people stuck because she was old enough to speak for herself and apparently awake.
Well, let's see that. I recall that case, and that was a caretaker who forgot her in the car, and unfortunately, she was going on a routine drive and then was distracted by a construction site that focused, in a sense, that's distraction and stress. It was quite a few years ago, and because she was so distracted by having to go around a construction site, lost awareness of Samaria. I am quite certain, though, that Samaria was sleeping in quiet for the entire drive. Because if she had been awake and made a sound, I'm sure that in that case she would not have been left in the car. So that's another example of you have an older child, but a child that was quiet for the entire drive. The question now is of age. Now, what is really terrible, it's all terrible in different ways. But think about a 4-year-old child. A 4-year-old child can get out of the car seat, or may not even be in a car seat. But a 4-year-old child doesn't have sort of the maturity to know to sit on the horn. And so a 4-year-old child is struggling inside a car, and the car is locked. A lot of times when you use a key fob to lock a car, and this has actually happened, you can't get out of the car, or you can't even figure out how to get out of the car. So the child couldn't get out of the car and didn't have the presence of mind that would come with more experience and maturity to sit on the horn to get attention from someone. And so I think it's after, think about it would require actually an older child to think, well, how am I going to get out? How am I going to get attention from someone? And a 4-year-old isn't capable of doing that. So a 4-year-old is about as old as I'm aware of, maybe 4 to 5. You also have children that find their way into cars and they get themselves locked in. And about a third of the time that does happen. That's not children being forgotten. That's children that get themselves into a car. They close the door, then they can't figure out how to get out of the car.
When you think about it, it is just so awful. And I'm hoping that people will become more amenable to the idea that it can happen to anyone's brain. If you can forget to stop for milk, you could potentially forget this.
Well, I hope that this kind of podcast can help to educate people, in particular law enforcement. So I'm contacted often by attorneys in which people are charged either by child services or by law enforcement with a crime. And sometimes the children are taken away from them because they're seen as negligent parents. And so in a case I just heard about, parents forgot a child in a car. They came back and were able to get their child out of the car. There was no harm done to the child. They called 911 and then they were charged with negligence. So, this is just really awful that law enforcement is so unaware of how common this is and how it happens to good parents, and that, parents should not immediately be seen as criminals doing this. And, there are just some horror stories in which one woman in Seattle forgot her child in a car and the child may have died or was damaged. I'm forgetting the details, but she was immediately arrested and she's in jail over the weekend. And, sometimes a parent isn't even permitted to attend the child's funeral. So just think about how you had this horrific experience for the child, followed then by a lifetime of trauma for the parents.
It's something that requires some level of empathy to put yourself into that person's shoes, which is part of the problem. I think a lot of people fail to have that.
That's right.
I wanted to ask also, I know there's quite a bit of controversy surrounding this particular case, but do you think that Cooper Harris's death brought the wrong kind of attention to this particular topic?
That was an infamous case indeed. So Ross Harris is a complex individual. He would clearly be described as not a good husband, not a good person. Okay, that's fine. He committed some immoral acts. Fine, that's all a given. When you look at him as a father, just look at his relationship with his son, Cooper. He was spectacular. He took such good care of that child. I could go on and on. Let's just accept that he was a wonderful father. And the pattern that occurred fit absolutely the pattern of this forgetting Cooper fit every other parent. And in fact, in my analysis, it's remarkably similar in his case to a case I had in Arkansas in which a man forgot his son, and it's remarkably similar. Without going into great detail, everything was in common between those two situations, except that the case in Arkansas, the man was a pillar of the community, magnificent person, wonderful father and husband, and he was a judge. So while he was sitting in judgment of other people, doing his job as a judge, his child died in the parking lot. So because Ross Harris had questionable morality, the jury judged him harshly, and there was quite a bit more involved in the case. He was found guilty, but yes, the Court of Appeals overturned the conviction because the judge, frankly, was unfair, was unprofessional. I'm really pleased to say that now that they were looking at the possibility of a retrial, I did not testify in the original trial, but I was able to interact directly with the prosecutor, explain how kids are forgotten in cars. I talked specifically about the Ross Harris case, how it was that he forgot Cooper in the car. There was also powerful testimony, description from the Kids in Cars folks. Amber and Janette talked about kids forgotten in cars and their analysis of Ross Harris's case. And I would like to say that as a result of our presentation to the prosecutor in this current case, I believe they felt they could not win a conviction. And that's just my opinion. But they chose not to retry Ross Harris, and they dropped charges. And so when he concludes his prison stay for the sexting that he was doing, then he'll be released from prison and he will no longer be found guilty of murder for his child.
That is huge. I have to admit, I let the media feed into my opinion on that case back when it happened, and I have villainized Ross in my mind for years, but understanding this phenomenon didn't even detract from that, I'm ashamed to say.
I have to say the media was really powerful, and as well, the authorities in this case manipulated the information. They were intentionally deceptive in trying to obtain a conviction. The judge was clearly partial and unprofessional. So you had the media going along with what the authorities were doing in providing misleading information to make Ross appear worse than he was. So it's understandable that if you got your information from the media, you would be led to believe that Ross did not value Cooper's life, which is completely wrong.
Yeah. And it's such a huge reason that I don't support the death penalty personally, because a lot of times there is corruption or incorrect information or one thing or another that leads to a person who's innocent of this particular charge being convicted.
That's a very good point. There are many murder convictions that are overturned because the conviction was based on eyewitness testimony. And that, I study memory and stress, and that certainly can be very flawed. And so in that sense, it really is important that there not be capital punishment when there's any doubt at all that that person might not have committed the crime.
Exactly. Well, I'm very glad to see that this is actually making a difference in real cases, and whether or not Ross Harris is a good person is completely irrelevant. He doesn't deserve to be punished for something he did not intentionally do or cause by negligence. So does the documentary Fatal Distraction focus on that case, or am I mistaken there?
That's a fantastic documentary. Yeah, I participated in, Janette and Amber participated in that. Yeah, I highly recommend it. It shows Ross as an outstanding father. He took Cooper to the Atlanta Braves games, even though he was only like 2 years of age. And he would go to Cooper's daycare dressed in Halloween outfit. He was the one who would take Cooper to daycare, and he would stay there and play with him at daycare. Someone contacted him from a website in which life was better without children, and his response was, "That's gross. I love my child, and I couldn't be happy without having my time with Cooper." The absurdity was he was up late. We talk about stress and sleep deprivation. He was up late that night because he was so looking forward to taking Cooper and his wife on a cruise. So he was getting a passport for Cooper that night, which kept him up very late, and he had gotten very little sleep the night before the event occurred. And I'll just add the last thing about Ross. I got to know him. I visited with him twice. And, I actually think it's, in hindsight, it's too bad he didn't testify because he's such a likable person. When you get beyond judging him and you get to know him, he is really a very likable person. And you can see the pain on his face. When I talked about Cooper, there was so much love there. But then when he thought about Cooper dying, it's just powerful how he is suffering, because not only because Cooper died, but because people are judging him that he wanted Cooper to die. And there's just clearly nothing could be further from the truth about that.
That is a tough one. It's not going to go away regardless of the conviction being overturned and the charges not being...
He'll probably still be judged by people.
Definitely, yeah. That is sad. That brings me to another question. When there are more than one parent involved, or when another parent is also the victim but did not suffer the memory lapse, how does that other parent cope? Is there something in the brain that can allow them to forgive, or is this just a very individual thing?
First, that's a great question. And I can't imagine, I have talked to people about this. I can't imagine, though, being on the receiving end to learn that your spouse has forgotten your child and the child has died. There's so much about this scenario that's just too hard to understand. Now, I have talked to many people who are spouse of the parent that forgot. It goes for either one, husbands and wives. And frankly, I have seen that the spouses in general are very supportive. At least in my experience, it's very rare that it will lead to divorce or a breakup of any kind. And it's very common that people are supportive, that people stay together and in fact go on to have more children. So I think in part because the spouse knows what kind of parent, the parent who forgot the child, what kind of person that parent is. So they are, as in a sense, confused as to how that can happen because they know how good the other person is as a father or a mother. So I guess my experience in seeing this is that the spouses have been supportive and they move on with it.
That's great, actually. I wouldn't have expected that necessarily, but it makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. They've seen what type of a parent they were.
Well, I tell you, they see the reaction of their spouse. And the reaction is perhaps maybe the most traumatic experience. I mean, people have PTSD. We're talking about serious trauma. We're talking about combat or rape. We are talking about truly horrific experiences. But to directly see your spouse that is beyond traumatized. And I know of one case in which a father forgot a child and then he committed suicide. And imagine now what his wife, she wakes up with a wonderful, normal life, goes to sleep, her child and her husband are dead. So that the trauma is just beyond belief. And so there are people who commit suicide, and it's potentially scientifically interesting to see. I think that would happen more often if there's only one child. When there are multiple children and one child has died, I think it's less likely the parent that forgot the child will want to commit suicide because they still have an obligation to their other children. But I think the spouse seeing this absolute trauma, the desperation, the pain that is beyond belief that their spouse is experiencing, I think that's what helps them to cope with it. And so that's what helps them to stay together.
Because they understand that it was something they didn't intend. That's important.
They understand, well, first they don't understand how it can happen. And then I've been able to help these people. But they see that there was no intention. And they see a suffering that is beyond belief in their spouse. And that, I think, evokes empathy in the spouse. Ross Harris's wife, Leanna, even though she learned of this double life, she still knew how much he loved Cooper. And she would not judge him harshly as a father. And so people know that their spouse is a good parent. And so that's why I think that helps. And actually, frankly, I have never had a case, I've never heard of an example in which a child is intentionally left in a car to die of heat stroke. There are people there, and actually, this is another example. This is actually kind of important. You do have people that intentionally leave children in cars, but they do it because they think the child will be safe. Now, that's clearly bad judgment, but they don't leave the child in the car to die. Now, it actually has happened that you have parents that leave a child in a car, and then as a result of doing something else, they lose awareness of the child in the car. So that's another kind of memory failure. One of the first cases I learned of was a dentist who had needed to drop by work with his child. He left the child in a car, went into work to just sort of to pick something up, and he became engaged in some activities at work and lost awareness that his child was in the car. And child died of heat stroke. So that is another way in which this can happen. And clearly the worst way this can happen is the person intentionally leaves the child in a car, has not lost awareness, and just thinks the child will be fine, like using the car as a daycare. That, in a sense, to me, that's irresponsible.
Yeah, I have covered one of those, the Velasquez kids in Arizona. And that is definitely a different situation. And also the fact that the mother there, Brittany, had some brain issues herself to begin with, compounded everything. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this. It needs to be out there that this can happen to anyone. And if people can just accept that, we might be able to bring those numbers down further. That's the hope.
Well, I really appreciate you inviting me to share with you what I've learned about these cases, both personally, scientifically, and in a sense, maybe the most important message to take from this for your listeners is not to be complacent or judgmental, to try to understand that this has happened to really wonderful people who never thought that this could happen to them. And so it is really important. First of all, don't judge these people, and then realize that this truly could happen to anyone. And once you accept that, then you take measures to make sure that it won't happen to you.
Now, I'll take another quick sponsor break, and then you'll hear my conversation with Janette Fennell, the founder and president of Kids and Car Safety, an essential nonprofit organization centered around the protection of our most vulnerable in and around vehicles.
My name is Janette Fennell, and I am the founder and president of Kids and Car Safety. And we work to keep kids and others safe in and around motor vehicles.
I wondered, because I've been following your site since probably 2002 or so, I think, before I even had kids myself, and it just fascinated me that there were so many dangers surrounding vehicles for kids. So I really thought it was something that I should highlight and go over with people who know what they're talking about, such as yourself.
Well, we appreciate you helping us spread the word.
No problem. How did you become involved in car safety advocacy like this?
Well, it's a kind of interesting story. When I ask people if they'd like to hear the short version or the long version, and they choose the short version, I tell them I got into this kicking and screaming, and that never satisfies anyone. So I'll tell you quickly pretty much what happened. My husband and I and our 9-month-old baby were coming home after having dinner with friends, and in the city of San Francisco, we pulled into our driveway and opened the garage door. But before the garage door had a chance to come all the way down, 2 masked men with loaded guns rolled under the garage door and put a gun to our heads and say, "Get in the trunk." They put us in the trunk. They took us to a secondary location. And there they robbed, assaulted us, and basically left us for dead in the trunk of our own car. But with a little divine intervention, we were somehow able to find that trunk release that is opened when you flipped a little button in the passenger compartment. So after we were able to escape, the worst part of the whole story came to light, and that was the fact that our baby was no longer in the car with us. Unbeknownst to us, the abductors had taken him out and threw him out in front of our house in his car seat. And I always mention that the sub-story here is the fact that a child's car seat can save their lives, even if it isn't in the car. Because we lived in San Francisco at that time, and he was 9 months and crawling. And if he had not been in that child safety seat, he would have just crawled right into the street and would no longer be with us. But no, he's a wonderful, thriving 28-year-old man. We did survive, and it didn't make any sense to me whatsoever that you could put somebody in the trunk of their own car and have no means of escape. So basically what this led to was collecting data, because there was no data about how often this happened. And, then going in front of legislators and auto companies and anyone who would listen to me. But the bottom line is we were successful, that now all vehicles, anything that's 2002 or newer, now come with a trunk release inside the trunk, and it glows in the dark. And that's how we get started. But the best part of this entire story is the fact that we have not been able to document one fatality in the trunk of a car that has that phosphorescent trunk release inside.
That is incredible. And if that was where you stopped your advocacy, that is such a huge accomplishment. But you haven't. You have taken this and run with it far beyond what anyone could have expected. I've seen that you've won dozens of awards over the past 25 years or so, and all of them are very well deserved. What would you consider your greatest personal and professional accomplishments as far as that goes?
My greatest personal accomplishment are my 2 incredible sons. They're just wonderful guys. But professionally, I think I'd have to really lean on the fact that the work that we're doing is saving lives. Because after we got the trunk releases in, I was finished. We had accomplished the mission of our organization, which rarely happens. But at the same time, people were coming to us and said, "Oh, you should help with power windows because they're strangling kids." Or somebody else would call and say, "Can you help me? Someone knocked a car into gear and killed my child." And I'm the kind of person that says, if you know how to fix something and you don't help, you're part of the problem. So what is really similar in all these type of incidents that we went on to work with is there wasn't any data collected about things that happen off the public road or highway. And very few people know that. They'll see the statistics like last year, 43,000 people died on our roads and highways, and everyone figures that's the total number. But it's far from the total number, because to be counted in that database, number one, you have to be involved in a crash. Number two, it has to happen on a public road or highway. And number three, the person has to die within 30 days of the incident. And if you can even start to imagine all the things that don't get gathered into that database, that's why we needed to build one. And things like trunk entrapment, things like children being left in hot cars, things like power window strangulations, all of those type of incidents happen on private property. So they were being totally ignored. And I learned that lesson as I was collecting data to eliminate the trunk entrapment problem. And of course realized when the people were calling for help, they were stuck due to that same process. So we started collecting data about things that happen off the public road or highway, and it is now referred to as non-traffic data.
Okay, and that's essential information because you're right. I mean, most people wouldn't think of those types of accidents, quote unquote, as traffic data. So that's actually great that it's separate. And your organization still tracks all of that data.
We do. And we were actually successful in getting a law passed that requires the federal government to collect some of this data as well. And they've done some random reports and, from the get-go, it was showing 7,000, 8,000 people were being killed, but over 800,000 people were treated in hospital emergency rooms each year. So we were not talking about a small problem here. And of course, we don't have access to the hospital records and some other things, but anything we can find, we document and we put it into our database. And we know that what we're collecting is just the tip of the iceberg. And we know that the federal government has a long way to go to get their data collection methods perfected as well.
Sure, but this is definitely a great start. And there is so much great information there. So I'll make sure that it's linked in the show notes for this episode. And I can't recommend it highly enough. And I've told so many people about it over the years that it's incredible to me that more people don't already know about it, especially parents. I wish that we could include a flyer or something in, the new parent paperwork packet when you send a parent home with a new baby or something like that. It really is so important that everybody knows this information.
Well, actually, that is one of our programs.
Oh, good.
And it's called Look Before You Lock. And we have these nice cards that have been made. And in any case where there's a birthing center, we have tried to make sure that the Look Before You Lock brochure is included in those parent packets. Now, there's 4 million children born every year. And obviously nobody has the budget to get to everyone. But, if there's birthing centers that are listening that would like to sign up for this program, we certainly can send them some of the brochures to add in their parent packets, because that's when families are really reading the information carefully and looking for ways to keep their children safe.
Exactly. Especially when it's brand new parents and they're terrified of everything, which I remember well, although it's been many years for me. But it definitely is the time where you are absorbing all of that information. So if we can reach anyone at that point, that's ideal. So I know that hot cars are obviously a huge danger, and that's what we're talking about today. But can you possibly touch on some of the other dangers, as you had said, trunk entrapment and window strangulation? And there's many others that are out there. What are some of those dangers?
Well, a very big danger is children being backed over. And that's in driveways or parking lots. And again, data was not being collected. So we're excited about this only in the fact that after 15 years, we were able to get a federal regulation passed such that now all vehicles, it doesn't matter where on earth they're made, but if they're sold or leased in the United States, you will get a rear view camera as standard equipment. You don't have to pay any extra for it, and you don't have to back up blindly anymore.
That is amazing. It really is. And I can't imagine operating my car without it. It's terrifying. I know I did see something. I get so many headlines in my email box, but I saw just last week there was a 1-year-old who got run over in their driveway because mom was repositioning the car. And they're so fast. Those little people with tiny legs, but they're so fast and so wily they can get out of the house at no notice whatsoever.
And they're very impulsive and they don't understand dangers. Like to them, the grass isn't any different than the driveway, or they can see mommy. So they assume mommy can see them, and nothing could be further from the truth. So backovers is a significant issue, but we're very excited about the fact that any vehicle 2018 or newer comes with that rear view camera. And I said this decades ago, and I get so excited when people say it back to me, which you kind of did. I don't know how I ever drove before without it. So obviously that's a very exciting thing for us to hear. Now, a newer type of danger that many people may not be aware of is what we call a frontover. And that's basically the opposite of a backover. And this is an alarming statistic, but 80% of vehicles being sold now are either an SUV or a pickup truck. And these vehicles are really high off the ground, and you can't see in front of them anymore. There's, in some vehicles, like an 8 to 16 foot blind zone in front of your vehicle where you can't see a child. It's one of these phenomena that we really need to get people educated about, because like backovers, you couldn't see the children and they were being run over and killed. Frontovers are the same thing. Now, there's some things that are going on right now, like AEB, which is automatic emergency braking, and then PAEB, which is pedestrian automatic emergency braking. But those things aren't out there. There are some vehicles that have some variations, but some of them don't work as good as others. So we really want the standard to be written by our government, and they're getting quite close to have that in place. But at the same time, we also think this cross traffic or anything that can sense that there's something in front of that vehicle, just like we did behind the vehicle, needs to be added. And the number of pedestrians that are being killed is a bigger increase. I think it's like 16%. It's higher than any other type of fatality involving vehicles.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and that's not even just small children. It's a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. Like grandma and grandpa are in the parking lot. Grandpa lets grandma out and didn't realize, maybe she tripped and fell in front of the vehicle, and then it's over. And these things happen in 2 seconds, and you live with the tragedy and the guilt of those type of incidents happening for the rest of your life.
I can't imagine. I really can't. That's definitely something that you're right. It definitely needs to be out there more for people to understand.
Yeah, we were also successful in this. Now, it's so exciting because when we get, some regulations passed and some technology added to vehicles, it's very exciting to see the numbers go down. But we were successful in getting something added to vehicles called brake transmission shift interlock. We call it BTSI, but really, to most of your listeners, it's the fact that you have to put your foot on the brake before you can put your car into gear. And why is that? Well, kids, dogs, and others were just knocking vehicles out of gear, and then they roll, and who knows what's going to happen, anywhere from a body of water to down a driveway. But now that that's been implemented, we're seeing that the children dying from vehicles set into motion is going down.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah. Another thing that we're very concerned about, and this kind of hits the hot car issue, but not exactly, is that children are being left alone in vehicles, and then the car is stolen with the child inside. And, I can tell you from having my baby missing, for a couple of hours, nobody wants to go through this. But it's a couple of children every week that this is happening all over the country. And those are just the ones we've been able to document. So it's just not safe to leave those little ones alone in the car anytime, hot, cold, or indifferent. But this is happening in the parking lots of gas stations, convenience stores. Older siblings are being dropped off at daycare. People running in a restaurant to pick up the food they've ordered. The list goes on, even to a point where some of these food deliveries like DoorDash and Uber Eats, people are like faking orders, and then when they bring it to the door, because they usually leave the car running, they're taking off. And it's not that these car thieves want your children, but they don't realize there's a child in there until they're in the vehicle or the child's crying. And then it does nothing but escalate, because either they ditch the vehicle because they certainly don't want to be charged with kidnapping, or they take the child out and just leave them somewhere and keep going with the car. So this is a major issue that we're following, and it's happening much too frequently. People will say it's just going to be a minute, and as maybe you run in to pay for your gas. How do you know the line's not going to be 10 people long? How do you know if the gas pump, wasn't working correctly? It's just not worth the heartache. And then additionally, we look at the misuse of law enforcement resources. One of these cases that happened, and an Amber Alert was issued, and we worked with the police jurisdiction that was part of it, and they were able to figure out just this one incident with all of that search and rescue and you name it. It was $70,000.
Wow.
And, someone would say, well, it doesn't matter. And I agree. You can put no price on children at all, but it's just not the right thing to ever leave these kids alone, helpless in a vehicle. And I can tell you 100 reasons why not.
And it's so preventable. We don't have to waste resources that way. I know it's inconvenient to take your kids into places with you. I very well remember having small kids, but it's just not worth it for any reason.
It is. It's a huge hassle to get those kids in and out of the car seat. But as I think we've all learned as parents, there's nothing convenient about children.
Very true.
Right? And we need to put their safety first. It's so much important than our convenience or the fact that it isn't convenient to keep getting them in and out. But, there is an answer to that, and that's as easy as leave them at home or get a plan with your neighbor, and you watch the kids while she does errands, and she watches your kids while you do errands. There really are some good ways around this.
Definitely. Anything's better than that lifetime of regret that you could experience.
Yeah, and I really don't want people to think that this can't happen to them, because I want them to know it's the best of parents that this happens to.
Mm-hmm.
And, as we transition into hot car deaths, since 1990, we have documented over 1,050 children who have died in hot cars.
Wow.
That's an average of 37 every year, about one every 90 days. And you look at the ages, they're 3 and under. In fact, 87% of the kids involved in this are 3 and under, and they're totally helpless. They're babies. And when people believe that can't happen to them, that's the biggest mistake they can ever make. Because people want to look at those sensational headlines, and they find a case where maybe somebody was doing drugs or alcohol. So they put it all in that same bucket and say, I don't drink. I'm not a monster. It's not going to happen to me. But they're not understanding that this has happened to an engineer, a juvenile court judge, school principals, teachers, college professors, a veterinarian, grandparents, stay-at-home moms, foster parents, social workers, pizza makers. There is no norm to who this does and can happen to. So
law enforcement and rocket scientists,
right?
And that's a huge part of the reason I'm doing this episode. Normally I do deal with exclusively child abuse cases, but there's a lot of people who misconstrue these as child abuse, neglect, just plain old terrible parenting, and it isn't in most cases. So that's why I really felt strongly about doing this.
Well, it's kind of an interesting little quiz I give to people. And I say, okay, we're talking about hot car fatalities and how they happen. So I want you to match up these two percentages, the 90% and the 10%. And what you need to match these two is incidents where a parent unknowingly left a child alone in a vehicle, and incidents where maybe they knowingly did, or there's some interaction with child protective services or alcohol or drugs. And 9 times out of 10, they get those percentages wrong, because it's really the minority that are parents that may not be keeping their children number one in their minds at all times. 90% of the time, it's really good parents that have every safety device known to man, but didn't know that this is something that can happen.
Right. The parents who say this could never happen to me.
Biggest mistake you can make absolutely the biggest mistake you can make.
That's the scary part. I mean, since having COVID especially, but I completely have always felt like my brain is fallible. You know, I know that there's definitely Swiss cheese holes and whatnot going on in there. And as much as my kids have always been number one to me, that didn't stop me from putting my purse in the back seat or something like that. The thought was always there as kind of a specter in my mind, which I'm glad it was. But I know that there's a lot of people who don't know that and haven't been cued into this sort of thing. And that's why it's so important, I think, that we do talk about it.
And please, not only take this to heart, but tell everybody you know, relatives, your babysitter, your child care provider. Everybody should be involved in planning and see what they can do to help keep your children from being hurt.
I know in New Jersey, in this state, there's a law that child care centers or whoever you send your children to must be informed if the child is not going to attend that day. And then they must also contact the parent if the child is not in attendance and they weren't told. But there's also so many states that don't have any legislation at all, or at least minimal, to prevent these sorts of things.
Well, I'll tell you, New Jersey is one of the few states that have that. And that's something we incredibly applaud and want to get laws like this in every state. And it's been very difficult. Child care providers have a rough job. There's many regulations and things that they need to comply with, which we totally understand. But in most cases, if your child isn't coming in that day, or they're sick, or you're out on vacation, it is just common sense and polite to let your child care provider know that the child won't be there. But then the agreement is that if you don't have my child and you don't have a call from me, here is every phone number conceivable from my emergency list that you can call so we can ensure the safety of the baby. And it just breaks my heart because I know literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children would be alive today if that one little phone call was made.
It would be a huge fail-safe, but you're right. It's got to be hard to pass those laws in states where there's a lot of opposition to it, or, certain lobbies will get in the way and things like that. So I applaud your organization for continuing to try to pass so many different laws and try to get so many different pieces of legislation started and followed through on.
And so much of this is not being the parent police at all. These type of laws help educate our communities as to things that could go wrong. And this one seems like simple and straightforward. And they say, oh, they're so busy, they wouldn't have time to call. And I'm like, well, in most cases, that parent is paying for 6, 7, 8 hours of childcare anyway. So don't you think a 5-minute or so phone call would be okay to do since you're not having to look after that baby for the rest of the day? So I think it's reasonable. But as we know, sometimes common sense isn't so common anymore.
Yeah, that's the sad part. What are the statistics per year? I know you had said there's over 1,050 since 1990 children who have died in hot cars in the U.S. alone, which is terrifying. Is that changing? Or do you see any trends going on?
Well, like you said, we don't have the benefit of a visual, but if you go to our website, which is kidsandcars.org, that's kidsandcars.org, and then click on the tab on the top left, and it's going to say hot car deaths. And when you open that up, it gives you a tremendous amount of information. It will tell you, how many kids have died so far this year, which is 12, unfortunately. And it will give you information about how many children have died in each state, a fact sheet, all sorts of tips. But there's a chart on there that happens to be my very favorite. And it's a graph where we have charted on one axis the fact that children used to die because of overpowered airbags. So you see in the 90s, when we started putting airbags in, they were so overpowered and they were killing children so quickly. The auto industry, the government, the advocacy groups, we all got together and said, oh no, we can't have this happening. And that's when we moved the children in the back seat. We forever changed the way children are transported in our country, but we've made no provisions to try to mitigate those unintentional consequences. So if you look at this chart since 1990, it will show you about 186 children died from overpowered airbags. Then you'll see a blue bar for each year, and it shows how many children died in hot cars. So that same time period, over 1,050 little ones have died in hot cars. I mean, it's not even a comparison as far as the airbag deaths versus hot car deaths. And we really can no longer let this happen. And it really is mind-boggling that we know that this is a problem, that we know as the sun sets and the sun rises every morning, people who love their children and snuggle with them at night, that they may not be there the next day because they've been unknowingly left alone in a vehicle. I'm sorry, that's just not right. And, you know, if lettuce is a problem, it comes off our shelves, and peanut butter, right? Or infant formula. We really do need to protect our children. So why in the world are we letting the auto industry get away with not adding this technology? Because they've already admitted that we're human, right? We get a reminder to put our seatbelt on because it's much safer that way. We get reminded if we leave our keys in the ignition, or to check our tire pressure, or the door is ajar, or if our oil is low. We're human and we need these reminders. And it's so unfortunate, but you can't buy a car today that either reminds you to turn off your headlights or it turns them off for you automatically, because God forbid, we do not want a dead car battery. And I am sorry, I don't want to sound over the top, but it's the perfect analogy to kids being left in hot cars. Why is one a bigger priority than the other? And it shouldn't be.
No, it shouldn't. And I see two reasons that this could be. One is that people just can't accept that it could happen to them because their kids are just too important to them that they could never forget. And two, it's got to be a liability issue that the car industry is looking at. You know what? If something is in place, but it doesn't work one time, we're going to be sued to kingdom come.
Well, they say that that's their worry about, you know, something not working and being sued. Well, it's not any different than the brakes on your car, than your tires. I mean, think about it, right? There's anything in your car that can go wrong. And when it does, sometimes people do sue the auto industry. But this isn't any different. This is a matter of life and death. And if we have all those other reminders there, we really need one to remind people if for any reason a young child or a pet or even a disabled person or an elderly person is left alone in the vehicle. And the technology is there and it works and it's not expensive. What we have seen and we think is a really good answer to this is a device, it's not much bigger than a computer chip, is installed in the headliner of your vehicle. I always call that the ceiling, but officially it's the headliner. And how that works is, you know, after you've arrived at your destination, it can sense if there's breathing, and I mean breathing even with a little tiny infant, and the infant has a blanket over them. It can detect that subtle breathing or movement. And if you turn the car off and you lock it, let's say you walk away, there's all sorts of things the car can do to tell you that someone's in danger. And that's anywhere from beeping the horn to flashing the headlights to sending a message to your cell phone that says, somebody's in the car, go check it out. It can even send messages to your emergency contacts to say, the baby's in the car alone, you know, need some help. And the pièce de résistance is the fact that it can even call 911 and give the location of the car so somebody can get there right away and intervene and save the life of a child, a pet, a disabled person, an elderly adult. The technology is there.
I had no idea.
It's actually in some vehicles. Some of the Hyundai or the Kia models have added something like this. The Genesis is also a vehicle that has this type of technology. And guess what? It's less than $50 a car.
Really? So it seems like that being standard is a no-brainer.
Right. And then let's add on the top of that, because it is so sophisticated. It can determine if you have your seatbelt on or not. It can determine if you're out of position. So I think they can save money by, let's say, taking out all the money it costs for seatbelt reminders and integrate that into the same system. So saving lives, saving money really seems pretty straightforward to me. But for some reason, I guess the auto industry doesn't agree.
I don't understand that at all.
I don't understand 1,000 and over 50 dead children.
Exactly. That to me is top priority. So you would think that other human beings, whether they're business people or not, would be on board with that.
We even have cases where someone who worked in a GM plant, their baby died in the parking lot because they were forgotten in a vehicle. And if nothing else, you'd think that would get them into action. But so far, we're seeing, at least from some not U.S.-based automakers, understanding the importance of this safety feature.
I'll pause here for another word from my sponsors. So it definitely does seem to fluctuate depending on the year. I saw 2020 was a lot lower, but that's for obvious reasons, a lot less commuting and such from the pandemic. But so 2018 was the deadliest year on record for hot car deaths.
It sure was.
Do you have any idea what the reasoning could be for that? Or was it, it just so happened to be higher that year? And what kind of trends do you see in this sort of statistic?
It's very hard to follow and actually call them trends. But you're right. We had a dip in 2020 due to the pandemic in 2021. And now, unfortunately, we're coming back to our average because in 2022, there was 36 hot car deaths. And right now with 12 fatalities, we're kind of on pace for the same thing that happened last year. But what we should really be focusing on is prevention. Everybody really wants this. And if you look in the newspaper, it's going to be in the criminal section. This really is a public health issue. And I can guarantee you that criminalizing parents does nothing to help other people remember their child. This truly has to do with our memory and our brains. And it's just not keeping up with all the things we're having to do and all the input that gets thrown on us. And, if there's anything we know about parents, especially when the children are under the age of 1, is number 1, they're sleep deprived. And number 2, that baby is rear facing and you can't tell as a driver if there's a baby in that car seat or not. I mean, talk about the odds. They're very tilted against you.
It seems to me people are just too confident in their own memories, which is crazy to me. Like I said, I've always known my memory is not infallible. So that's why I felt it was so important also to talk to Dr. Diamond for this episode. It's fascinating to me how this can happen. And ever since I read his input into the Fatal Distraction article back in 2009, I've just been completely enthralled by this information and how it can happen. And the overconfidence of people thinking that it could never happen to them. I've always thought I'm an excellent parent, but at the same time, if I can forget to pick something up on the way home, which I've done more times than not probably, then I can certainly, forget my 1-year-old is in the car if they're sleeping.
And that's really the key message. If you've ever forgotten anything, and who hasn't, it's the same brain mechanism. And that's when people will say, but it's your child. We love our child. They're number 1. We just can't live without them. And they're our precious babies. But in our brain, we don't differentiate that. And, a couple of the examples I like to use, and this isn't being compared to children. It's just how our memory works, kind of out of sight, out of mind. So you're coming out in the morning and, you've got your computer and your handbag and your lunch and your gym bag and, you're trying to manage all these things with your cup of coffee. And so you set your cup of coffee on top of the car because you need to find your keys and open the door. You find your keys, open the door, and then all this combination of stuff that you've brought with you, you get in the car. Well, maybe that takes 3-5 seconds, right? Well, in those 3 to 5 seconds, you have changed your mindset from putting the coffee on the top of the car to getting into your vehicle and putting your stuff in. And when that happens, you close the door and take off. But your car has this wonderful coffee bath all over it because in those few seconds, you go from trying to get into your car to having everything in there and away you go. The same thing is when you go to the copier to make a copy. You put in your original, you walk away with your copy. You got what you came for. And then 3 hours later, you're like, where is this original? I can't find the original. Guess what? It's covered up because you couldn't see it in the copier. It's things that we think are simple and somewhat memory-based, and they have nothing to do with our children, but they do. They absolutely do. It just shows how our mind works. Who has ever gotten into their car and gets on autopilot? And I know a lot of people tell me on Saturdays they drive to work and they don't even have to go to work that day. Or they miss the exit on the highway. They think they're paying attention. Here's a little game some ladies told me about in their office. So they were talking about the issue of hot car deaths. And there was one person, in their group. He said, there is no way ever you're going to convince me that these aren't happening on purpose or that these aren't bad parents. And there's just no way he was going to be convinced. So what the ladies decided to do, which I thought was brilliant, is anytime he forgot something, they said, you forgot the baby. So they went out to lunch one day and he goes, oh my gosh, I forgot my wallet. Can I borrow a couple bucks? And they said, you forgot the baby. And this went on for like 2 weeks and he finally figured it out. If you have a naysayer, isn't that a great way to try to help them understand? It doesn't make any sense to argue with people, but people do need to understand that our memories are so fallible. And, between email and text messages and the phone and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and our daily lives and taking care of the kids, it's a lot that we're dealing with. And it doesn't take much for something to fall.
Summer is here. Clearly, the numbers are going to start ramping up, unfortunately.
Isn't it sad you have to say that?
I know. It hurts to have to say it because someone is cuddling their child to sleep tonight and has no idea that they're not going to see another summer. And it kills me just to think about it. But that's why I want to talk about this so much. And I have been for years, telling people about your website and all the horror stories I've heard. But this can happen year round. It's not just summertime, right? I guess it's statistically it's higher in summer, but that's another thing people need to be aware of.
Well, we'll say it happens more often in, June, July, August, but we have documented fatalities in every month of the year. And that's another thing that maybe people don't appreciate is the fact that our car acts like a greenhouse. And the highest jump in temperature is the first 10 minutes after closing and locking your car. It can jump as much as 20 degrees. So here we are all across the country with 90-degree days. In 10 minutes, that car could be as hot as 110, and it just keeps going up from there. And as we know, that's not survivable. Now, add that high temperature to the fact that children's bodies do not have a developed respiratory system. They really can't get that heat out. And remember, their back is up against a pad in a plastic car seat. So there's no place for that to go. So again, another recipe for disaster where everything is kind of working against you. But people are really surprised when we tell them that we have actually documented cases where the temperature was in the low 60s. And there was enough heat generated that caused a baby to die from heat stroke.
Exactly. I mean, when I covered Lorenzo and Brooklyn's case, yes, they're in Arizona, but they passed away in March in the car. It can happen any time of the year, pretty much. The greenhouse effect can happen at lower temperatures, which is unexpected, but something that needs to be put out there.
Absolutely. And sometimes people, have left children in cars and then they lock them and they let the vehicle keep running because they think that the air conditioning will keep them safe. Well, we have several cases like that as well, that the baby did not survive because the air conditioning gave out.
The sense of guilt, and in that case, it's intentional that they were left in the car. So the whole concept of whether or not there should be criminal prosecution, that's a whole other story. But as far as the majority of these, like you said, they are accidental rather than ignorance.
Right. And the other thing we try to be very careful about is using the word intentional, because people who, what we say, knowingly leave their children alone in a vehicle definitely did not have the intent that they would die. They just either didn't know it or they underestimated how long they would be gone. And I mean, we've got cases where a child, this isn't just one, there's several cases where a child was left alone in the car and found a gun and killed themselves or a sibling. If it can happen, these little minds and fingers will figure it out.
They definitely will. You're right about that. There's a lot of dangers you might not even think of. And yes, in cases like that, people will say, well, that's just stupidity. And sure, maybe it is, but there's also so many where it's not that at all. To your knowledge, has a hot car ever actually been used as a murder weapon per se, the way the media and the prosecution said Ross Harris did?
Well, it's important to get an update on the Ross Harris case because we would agree he wasn't a very good husband. And we would agree that some of the things he did with regards to sexting and other things was not appropriate. But he was a good father. And that comes from his ex-wife. And when she was put on the stand to testify, she said, I'm only here to tell the truth. And this man has taken everything from me, but I can't lie. He was a fabulous father. He loved that little boy more than anything else. And I remember even some of the ladies of the night that testified said that he told them how much he loves his little boy. But the case was put on an appeal, and the Supreme Court of Georgia dismissed the charges, and then it had to go back to Cobb County. And I'm really quite happy to say is they are not going to recharge him. He did some very bad things. He did not intentionally cause the death of his precious little Cooper.
That's incredible. And I definitely went along with the media narrative there, just followed along and took what they spoon-fed me. And then when I finally started learning these things that you're telling me right now, I was completely blown away that I could just be that non-subjective and hear something and just take it in that way. I definitely plan to check out the documentary. It's called Fatal Distraction as well.
Yes, that would be a recommendation high on my list. If you're a reader, I'm not just saying it's good. We work with Gene Weingarten on this, but he won a Pulitzer Prize. So we'll let that prize speak for his article that appeared in the Washington Post. But it's still relevant today. I feel it's the best thing that ever was written about this topic. It literally has even changed minds.
It changed mine, that's for sure. I mean, there certainly was a little more judgment on my part prior, even though I was well aware of your website. But when I read that piece, all of it came together for me. Hearing from those parents, that's what did it.
Well, and understanding what the Swiss cheese model is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And, when all the things align, unfortunately, the worst things can happen. And then with the documentary, which was done by Susan Morgan Cooper, I would certainly encourage your listeners to watch that as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely link to it.
Oh, good. Because that's a good watch too. And it does help explain things. But it was incredibly disappointing when we saw really some of the out and out lies that the prosecution put out there. And, anywhere from searching, to have a child-free life. He didn't search to do that. Somebody sent him a link. He looked at it and his response was grossness.
Right.
So it's like quite the opposite, right?
Yeah. They definitely twisted things. And that's why I wondered, have you heard of any cases that have been intentional in that sense? Not even just knowingly, but intentionally leaving a child in the car to die.
There might be one and maybe two. But that's such the rare exception. I've seen some as part of a plot on a TV show, but it was just incredible that anyone would even think that way.
You'd have to be sincerely, and I don't like to throw this word around, but evil. You'd have to be flat out evil to use that as a method, I would think.
Oh, by all means, and you're not even guaranteed it would work. How do you like that? Besides all these fatalities, what a lot of people don't realize are a lot of children do survive, but in many cases with serious brain damage and lifelong disabilities. And I think those actually should be counted in the numbers as well.
Yes.
Because they're never going to be that same little child that they used to be.
Yeah, they're going to grow up into an adult who needs full-time care, and it really does affect many, many lives.
Everybody's. So understand that there's so much more to this topic than just kids that die or don't die, and that some of these lifelong disabilities just break your heart, especially, as you keep saying, and which I agree, They're so preventable. I think it was probably a good idea maybe to give your listeners some tips or hints that are absolutely free, and you should put them into place right now. So one of the things we like to tell people is keep a stuffed animal in your child's car seat. You know, kind of a big one where you couldn't fit the baby in there too. So in your mind, you know there's always something in the baby's car seat. So as soon as you're going to put your child in the car seat, you can place that stuffed animal in the passenger seat because we're cue dependent as adults. So when the baby's in the car seat, the stuffed animal's up front. So then we know, because there's always something in that car seat, that the baby is with you. Another thing I think you mentioned is to put something in the back seat of your car before you leave, and that could be your cell phone. That would be a best one. Put your cell phone back there. You're going to be a much better driver. Put it in the pocket right in front of where the baby is. Your employee badge, your handbag, anything like that. And the reason we call that look before you lock is because we'd like people to get into this habit. Again, it's free. It only takes 3 seconds. Is when you get out of your car, open the back door, and you can retrieve all of those items that you need, to go to work or whatever you're doing that day. But also it gives you that visual check that the baby is no longer with you. What a great check to look before you lock to make sure that especially no children have been left behind. And then we did talk a little bit earlier about making sure that you have a plan with your child care provider and to call you if your baby doesn't arrive on time. Now, there's another way that children die that we haven't touched on yet, and that's a full 26% of children get into hot cars all on their own. And that advice, of course, is to make sure your cars are always locked, even if they're in the garage and in the driveway. We feel safe at home. But boy, do kids like car keys. Boy, do they like that little button that makes the trunk go up or our car go beep. It's sort of like your very own Jack in the Box. You push a button and it makes noise. So, they're attractive nuisance, especially for boys. But make sure that you have some sort of a system in your house where you can tell if a door's been opened, and then, you can go check to make sure that your child hasn't for the first time got out of the house unbeknownst to you.
Oh, they're clever.
Oh, aren't they? And you never know when their cleverness is going to the next level. And that's kind of our point, is just don't let them get in there on their own. And by locking the cars, keeping the keys out of reach of children, those type of really simple things can really help to put your mind at ease.
It seems like a little bit of habit forming is most definitely worth it. And I'm sure if you asked any of the parents that you have dealt with over the years, they would say the same thing.
Oh, they would give anything to have their little babies back. And in fact, these parents are our heroes, because not only have they somehow lived through the most tragic thing that can ever happen in your life. And people will agree that the worst thing that can ever happen is your child dying before you do. But if you think that's the worst thing, how about if you ratchet it up about 1,000 times? Now, not only has your child died, but you're the one responsible. I can't think of anything that's worse than that. And these parents come and bring pictures of their children and talk about it. And as you might imagine, are criticized and people are judgmental. But they keep showing up because they don't want another family to have to feel and go through what they're experiencing every day of their life for the rest of their life. We find that technology along with education is the way we're going to solve this. Just like seatbelts have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, just like airbags have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, just like little glow-in-the-dark trunk releases have saved some lives. This can do the same. It's available. It's not expensive. The only thing we need is the political will to make sure it happens.
And that's going to be a matter of constant public outcry, or at least advocacy, which is what you're doing. And it's so valuable. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done over the years to make this a visible topic that people actually will wrap their brains around, or at least try.
It's important to know that we were successful in getting a provision about adding technology to vehicles as part of the 2021 infrastructure bill. So there is language. The language that got passed isn't exactly what we want. What we wanted was the language in the House bill, but when it went over to the Senate, they put their language in there, which is not as good as it should be. But in working with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, that's known as NHTSA, we've been talking to them, and they say they're going to do the right thing. And we want to believe that, of course. And actually, that regulation is supposed to be written by November of 2023 this year. But they're already behind, and we cannot allow any more feet dragging after we've had feet dragging for 20 years. So I think putting some pressure on our congresspeople and our senators, for anyone that's listening, tell them to make sure that we get technology added to our vehicles that can detect, that's the key, that can detect if someone's been left alone in a vehicle, and then alert not only passerbys, but the driver of that vehicle and others.
If there is something actionable in this episode beyond taking these precautions that we've talked about to protect your own children or the children in your care, it's contact your representatives about this legislation that needs to go through.
Well, the legislation has gone through. That's the good news. But what we need, and this is on a federal level, so, you have your U.S. reps and your U.S. senators, that's just 3 people each to contact and say, let's make sure we get technology added to our vehicles because we're human, because we have all these other reminders in our vehicles already. Why are we missing the one that can save the lives of innocent children? We're not asking people to pass the bill. We're asking DOT, the Department of Transportation, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to make sure this happens, and it happens as quickly as possible, and that the effective technology that is installed has the ability to detect and alert. Some of the automakers have decided on their own to add something that doesn't cost any money, and it isn't very effective. And what they've added is what they call a rear seat reminder. And how that works is if you open the back door before you leave for your journey, when you turn your car off, you're supposed to get a little notice. And it says, check the back seat. Well, you could have put a bag of potato chips back there, and you're going to get that same warning. And what we have found is 2 things. 1, people are very confused about it. 2, if it is something you see every time you turn off your vehicle, you ignore it. And we actually know of at least 4 or 5 children who have died in vehicles that had that. So it's really just a door sequencing. So if I open the back door, then something will happen when I arrive. But people are very confused about it. We've had children die because it isn't working the way someone would think. And quite frankly, it's caused a lot of confusion because people say, oh, I got this new car and it tells me to, check the back seat. And I'm like, well, that's great, but that isn't going to save lives. And it might save a couple here or there. So let's say it's better than nothing. But unfortunately, what that has done is lull people into thinking that there's something there to help them when it's really quite remote that it would.
Well, I guess it's better than nothing, but if there's so much more advanced technology available now for such a low cost, it seems unconscionable that the auto industry and our legislators wouldn't implement that.
Amen to that. We're not going away. We're not giving up. It's taken us a very long time to get legislative language to pass through the finish line that goes to the president's desk. That happened in July or November of 2021. So let's do it. Let's get it done. Let's save our babies' lives.
Exactly. Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking about all this. And it's a very dark topic, obviously. I mean, I'm accustomed to dealing with dark topics, unfortunately. But that was my last question for you is you have to deal with a lot of darkness in this area. How do you balance that in your life?
Well, some days are more difficult than others. And I don't know how we have magically been spared, but sometimes when I just am so down. Somebody else on the team does the pull me up, and when they're down, I'm the pull me up. So it's going to be bad if we're both down on the same day. So
Right, yeah, no doubt.
But yeah, it is difficult. And the only thing really that keeps us going day to day is we know we can make a difference. We know with safer power window switches and the glow in the dark trunk releases and the rear view cameras, those type of things, that they do make a difference and they're saving lives. So that's what keeps us going. And that's what fuels the hard work that we put into this 24/7.
Huge thanks to both Dr. David Diamond and Janette Fennell for their willingness to talk to me about this topic. It's truly my honor to share those conversations with you. Janette was kind enough to provide me with a template email that we can use to write to our federal representatives and senators, letting them know how essential it is to require all future passenger vehicles manufactured in the United States to have technology that can detect a child's presence and alert someone. I'll post that letter on my website and link to it from the show notes so you can copy and paste it. I'll also include instructions on how to send the letter automatically to your members of Congress in under a minute. It couldn't be easier, so please take the time to send the letter to save children's lives. I decided to create this episode for 2 reasons. First and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, this topic has been lodged in my mind for over 20 years, since even before I had kids of my own. As such, just as my main reason for creating this entire podcast was to help prevent child abuse by raising awareness, my main reason for creating this episode was to help prevent hot car injuries and fatalities by raising awareness that we are all vulnerable to the type of memory failures that cause them. In an online discussion on March 9, 2009, about his Washington Post article, Gene Weingarten fielded questions from readers, some of which were thoughtful and empathetic, while others were predictably judgmental, high-horse material. I want to end this episode with Mr. Weingarten's answer to one reader's question, which was, "Why would you write this story? Isn't there enough publicity about this when it happens? Why add to the guilt and shame of those involved and add to the painful, empathetic response of parents everywhere?" Mr. Weingarten's answer aligns with both my first and my second reason for creating this episode. If you've heard this podcast before, you already know how crucial it is to me that we treat the victims I talk about and their families with empathy. So why did Mr. Weingarten write this story? To that question, he replied, "So it will happen less often. So when it does happen, the poor, decent, terribly damaged people to whom it happens are not demonized by an ignorant public." Amen. My sources for this episode were Gene Weingarten's Washington Post article, Susan Morgan Cooper's documentary, Fatal Distraction, kidsandcars.org, The Atlantic, Psychology Today, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, CNN, Janette Fennell, and Dr. David Diamond. Please share this episode with everyone you know who has small children or cares for small children, whether they be parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, caregivers, babysitters, daycare providers. The more people know about the dangers of hot cars, the fewer children will be injured or killed by heat stroke. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another episode. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/stlcpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.